So first of all, talking administratively. Now, a point that What If Alt this made, yeah, which I kind of disagreed with, and which is why I'm kind of making this video, is that he basically said that what more likely than not would have happened was that you'd have like a parliament in America, much in the same way as the Scots had a parliament before the Act of Union, and just like with the Irish as well before the Act of Union. Now, I'm not questioning this in terms of the practicalities of this, but I think long term, basically this model here would have just meant that the Americans colonies, yeah, end up basically following the same pattern that eventually Canada and Australia would have, which is that eventually they end up getting independence, but they would still stay politically tied to the British Crown and to Britain itself. So that's not very interesting, because for that we can pretty much just copy and paste the experience of Canada and Australia to the American experience. So to make it slightly more interesting, to spice things up a little bit, what we're going to suggest instead is an idea which was floated almost a century later, which was the idea of an imperial federation. To make this slightly more interesting, we'll have a situation in which the white dominions end up basically being part of this imperial federation. Now, as we've said many, actually at this point now, many years ago, when we were talking about what if the British Empire never existed, and in those scenarios there, I spoke about, what if there was only just the white part of the empire, and what if there was just no empire at all? In that, I made the point that India and the other kind of like non-white colonies, their population is so massive that it would have turned the British Empire not into being a kind of British Empire, but it would have turned it into essentially an Indian Empire just because of population. So the only way that this would have been somewhat workable is if basically the empire was maintained on kind of racist lines where it's only the white dominions, yeah, so places like America, Canada, Australia, etc., being able to actually have a say. So in this regard, I think this is the only way that the American colonies maintain kind of this system of being within the British Empire, yeah, is by actually including them. So basically you could have, for instance, a governor general or someone from each of the different states, and over time this would eventually evolve into something more representative. Because obviously you have to remember at the time that in Britain itself, the constituencies, you had the rotten boroughs and stuff, so there wasn't actually a great deal of representation there. And also don't forget the fact that only about 3% of the population, of the male population there, could even vote at the time. So you have to consider all these different things, yeah, when we're talking about like how this would be set up. And it's a gradual thing which would have to evolve over the centuries. So this kind of covers the administrative part of it, right? Now talk about the cultural part of it. And I think the main thing to speak of culturally is kind of the issue of slavery. Now we're going to cover that more in the next video, where we talk about, what if the slave trade was ended in 1772. So definitely stay tuned for that video. But when we talk about this, we have to bear in mind the difference between how America ended slavery and how the British Empire ended slavery. So in the case of America, there was obviously the Civil War, in which the northern states who didn't want there to be slavery and didn't want slavery to expand ended up having a fight with the southern states, which not only saw it as the central kind of building block to their whole way of life, but also wanted to expand this into the western states. However, when we contrast this to how the British Empire ended slavery, they ended slavery by essentially paying compensation to the slave owners. And this comes back to the kind of fundamental rights of Englishmen, right? Which is this thing of life, liberty, and property. And so if the slaves in those days were seen as the property of the slave owners, the only way that the state could intervene was by compensating them for the loss of their property, quote unquote property, right? So the British Empire in 1837 passed a law which maintained that there would be the compensation for the loss of slaves, right? So the 40,000 slave owners within the empire, for all different places in the Caribbean, in Mauritius and many other places, right, they would be compensated, right? So the sum was in those days £20 million, and obviously when we extrapolate this into modern day terms, it's several billion. We covered this more in our video about reparations, the reparations debate, so definitely check that out. But with regard to all this, we have to bear in mind that this is much less feasible in a scenario where the American colonies are maintained, because surely because of the size of the population in comparison to the Caribbean, the issue of slavery was far more pertinent, and there were far more slave owners in the southern states. Now, annoyingly, I can't get any data for the 1840s or the 1830s as such, but I can get the census from the US Census in 1860, and what we find with that is that in the American states at this time, there were over 316,000 slave owners within the United States. So this basically means that you talk about 40,000, paying 40,000 compared to paying 40,000 plus potentially 316,000. Now, obviously, the population would have changed, so there have been slightly less than 300,000. Let's even say it's 200,000, right? That is an order of magnitude much larger than 40,000, of course. And it was a thing where the British government spent almost 40% of its budget in that year paying these slave owners, and it wasn't until 2015 that the full amount of that of that loan was basically fully paid back. So this means that, like, if you have something on the order of magnitude of 5 or 8 times larger, than what it actually is, first of all, it becomes much more politically difficult for people in Britain, but also it's a thing where it just puts additional strains on things in general. So a big reason why a similar thing wasn't done in America was because in America you had weak federalism at this time. So the northern states, who were opposed to slavery, didn't want to pay the southern states for the sake of, like, compensating them for the loss of property. So it ended up becoming this very tense, unworkable thing, which eventually led to civil war. Now, in this scenario here, either Britain would have coughed up this money and paid the slave owners, right? Or they would have been like, no, you're ending slavery and that's just that. In which case, there may very well have been a rebellion, in like the 1830s or 1840s. Now, if that was to happen, what we have to bear in mind is that while the American Civil War lasted for 4 years, in this situation here, it would have lasted much less time. The reason being is that this was just the northern states versus the southern states. But in this scenario, where we can imagine the entire British Empire and the northern states jumping in, right? A big reason why the Confederacy lasted as long as it did is out of the hope that Britain would end up recognizing the Confederacy and that they would become independent. So in a situation like this, where the whole might of the British Empire and the northern states, or the northern colonies, are ganging up on the southern colonies, it would be crushed very, very soon. Now, if we look society wise, right, we have to kind of bear in mind, for instance, if we look at South Africa, right? So South Africa, where you had the British and the Afrikaans, right? The British there had a kind of form of segregation, and this was mainly to appease the kind of Afrikaans, right? Because they came in to South Africa and eventually end up outlawing slavery. So this is why you had the Great Trek, which we covered in a previous video as well. But in this instance here, it's a very similar kind of thing, in the sense of you had segregation while the British were in South Africa, but as their influence waned and as they kind of withdrew, the Afrikaans within South Africa end up imposing apartheid, right? So this is where there was obviously very, very strict laws, very similar to how it was in under the Jim Crow system in the South. So what we can imagine in this timeline here is that, yes, there would have still been elements of Jim Crow if the British were still in control, but it would have been far less than it was in our own timeline, where the southern states had full autonomy and they could just do whatever they wanted to their black population. The British government often were a restraining force, both in Canada and Australia and many other places, whereby even when the white settlers out there wanted to, and actually did commit genocide against the natives, the British government was a restraining force on that as much as it was able to. So much in the same way, if we look at Native Americans and we look at slave population and stuff, there wouldn't have been the same level of basically extermination and terrorism which end up befalling both the natives and the black population of the United States.